Ladies and gentlemen, welcome in this Global Fleet webinar, covering the essential elements of a telematics policy. We organized this webinar with the support of Mix Telematics. My name is Schoefs. I'm the Chief Editor of Global Fleet, and I have the pleasure to be the moderator of today's webcast. The webinar today is for information purposes only, and is not a sales tool. The information given cannot be reproduced without permission. But what information are we going to bring to you? Well, today's webinar is about telematics. And as you know, telematics is a topic as exciting as challenging. Exciting because everyone realizes that telematics supports a safer and more efficient mobility. But it's also challenging because the adoption of telematics is not an easy one for every organization and in every country, mostly due to concerns about privacy. But let's be clear, telematics has important benefits and is set to change the way we drive and to improve road safety. When implementing a telematics solution to improve driver safety, it's clear that a well-established policy goes hand in hand with achieving stakeholder and driver buy-in. In this Global Fleet webinar, organized with the support of industry specialist Mix Telematics, you will get insight in the essential elements to ensure the success of your telematics program. A case study by Wincanton with 7,500 vehicles, one of the biggest fleets in the UK, will explain how they have successfully implemented a telematics program that benefits both the employees and their own business. Ladies and gentlemen, it's really a pleasure that we can have two experts today in this webcast. First of all, we will listen to Wayne Fee. Wayne is Head of Global Sales and Land Transport Safety Specialist at Mix Telematics. And afterwards, we will have the case study of Wincanton, done by Hanson, the Group Fleet Director. During the webinar, there will be no interaction, let's say, with the audience, but all participants, of course, are really welcome to send their questions for the experts by using the chat function of the webinar. Because at the end of this webinar, we will have a lively Q&A together with our two experts. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's kick off. And I hope that our first expert, Mr. Wayne Fee of Mix Telematics, is in the webinar room. So, Wayne, is it possible that you can hear me? And if so, you can start. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen, for the introduction, and thanks to everyone for joining the webinar. So we're going to discuss telematics policy and some of the essential elements of that policy or program. Just start off by quickly looking at some of the main reasons or the main drivers that a fleet may choose to adopt telematics within their business. The first being efficiency, and in order to reduce the costs associated with running a fleet, things like fuel savings, wear and tear, reduction in maintenance, extension of vehicle lives, important considerations with today's fleets, and efficiency is one of the primary reasons that fleets would adopt. Safety is another one. In order to improve driver safety, reduce crashes and incidents. Compliance, depending on which country or which area you are in the world, there's a number of regulations and rules such as hours of service, electronic work diaries, ELD in the United States, etc. And telematics helps you to be able to comply with these regulatory requirements around the world. And the last one on the screen there is security. By having telematics on board, it provides visibility of the location of your vehicles and drivers, and prevents or helps to prevent and reduce theft of vehicles and assets. So typically we'd see those four reasons I've spoke about as the key drivers for a fleet adopting telematics. Next slide, please, Stephen. Okay, so why is a telematics policy or program needed? So we need to be able to establish some expectations for our employees that are driving the vehicles and using the telematics. So a policy or program helps to set out clearly and defined expectations for those that are going to be a part of the telematics program. Where we do have telematics in place, it's crucial for us to draw up a suitable policy because it protects both the company and the drivers and provides a guideline for those who are interacting with the policy. It's recommended when we're implementing a policy that all drivers review it and sign and date it before they're allowed to drive a company vehicle. It should be noted that you know, a policy does not necessarily have to be clearly defined and written. As long as it's defined and understood by the drivers, lots of companies choose to adopt a program with a set of guiding principles as opposed to a formal policy. Next slide, please, Stephen. Okay, so why do we need a telematics policy or program in the first place? Importantly, it guides employees on safe road use. It helps us to set some expectations and us to convey to the driver what things we're looking to prevent or what things indeed we're looking to achieve. So we talk about what constitutes safe driving, speeding, harsh braking, harsh acceleration, areas like fatigue and distraction, talking on the phone, which is very topical in today's world, driving with seatbelts, etc. Also, it may be able to, or lots of companies use it to assist in guiding drivers to be what we call eco drivers, and typically a safe driver is an eco-friendly driver, and that also has the byproduct or the result of also helping us to achieve their return on investment that we spoke about. The policy should show the risks involved. I mean, what happens if we don't comply with the policy? What happens if we don't drive safe? We're looking at possible lost time, possible serious injury, hopefully not death, but that does certainly occur. Reputation, damage to reputation, particularly if we're driving company branded vehicles as well. So what are the risks involved if we don't comply with the policy? What are the consequences of those risks? What are the results of unsafe driving practices? We spoke about crashes and incidents there, damage to reputation, etc. So we're helping to establish a clear framework here and help guide the drivers and the people interacting with telematics as to, you know, what our expectations are and what could happen if we don't comply. And we also should mention how we're going to reduce the risk and what consequences if we don't reduce the risk. So what can ultimately happen? What is going to happen if we see a driver whose performance can do with some improvement? What coaching or training steps are we going to put in place? Or what incentives are we going to give for drivers to be able to comply and all be safe drivers at the end of the day? Next one, please, Stephen. Okay, so moving towards some of the essential elements of a telematics policy. Yeah, I must mention that policies differ from company to company, but we've found as a rule that the ones I'll go through now are probably what we would consider to be those essential ones that should be contained with any program or policy. So we must clearly define the goals. It's important that we define the goals. What are we as a company trying to achieve? At the end of the day, we need driver buy-in to be able to achieve our goals. So what's the reason the company has chosen to implement telematics? Is it to run a more efficient fleet? Is it to reduce those crashes and accidents that we spoke about in the first place? So define what we want to get out of it as a company. We outline the roles and the responsibilities. So the driver's role, what role do they play in it? How can they assist us in achieving our goals as a company? What are the administrative roles? What other stakeholders are involved in the process? We position the mandates, the rules, so depending again on what country we're operating in, what rules do we need to be compliant with, what policies or regulations or mandates do we also need to come into line with. And then we explain who must comply. Does this apply to only our professional drivers? Does it maybe apply to our part-time or casual drivers as well? Does it possibly apply to contractor drivers that we bring in for particular jobs? So everyone using a vehicle or using telematics must clearly know that the policy or program applies to them as well. Explain the system use and access. So what have we installed in the vehicles? We've installed a black box in the vehicles. How does that work? How is a driver's experience going to be? What does he need to do to log on to the system? Does he have a particular access key or access code? What's going to happen if he exceeds some of the parameters we've set up in the system? We define the system administrators. Who are they in the organisation? What role do they play? What data do they have access to? And who do we go to if we need to understand something? We want to see our performance, for example, or we have a question. So we must define who those system administrators are and how they're going to play a part in the telematics implementation. And importantly, we need to be transparent about driver performance, and we need to explain how we're going to be transparent. Are we going to publish our results on a notice board in terms of our drivers? Typically, organisations will adopt what we call a RAG, or a red, amber, green report, which shows the best performing drivers in the green, those that need some assistance maybe in the amber and the red. So are we going to put that on a notice board? Are the drivers going to be able to access that data themselves, maybe through a cell phone app or something similar? But we must be transparent, and the drivers must, at the end of the day, as we say, buy into the process. There needs to be some benefit for them. Next one there, please, Stephen. Spoke about driver buy-in. It's probably one of the most critical things that we see in implementation of telematics, and a successful implementation. Driver buy-in needs to be there from the start. We must engage with the drivers before we get to a policy. We don't want to be in a situation where the first time drivers hear about telematics is when they're reading a policy or understanding a program. We need to have that buy-in from the very beginning. And that creates a sense of accountability, and it motivates them to take care about not only their own personal safety, but also about the fleet success and the fleet objectives. It also creates an open channel of communication. And by achieving driver buy-in, we're able to get insights from drivers that only they can provide. They're the ones on the road every day. They're the ones who face the problems. There may be issues with the telematics system. There may be issues with the roads or the conditions which are causing them some concern. So to have them buy into the process from the very beginning allows them to open up and share that crucial information to us. Moving to the next one, please, Stephen. Okay, so how do we achieve the driver buy-in? As I said, we need to be transparent from the very beginning. They need to understand why, and they need to understand what role they play. We need to have their input and take their input on board in order to improve and in order to maintain the momentum that we're going to achieve and the success that we're going to achieve through the implementation. Incentive schemes, lots of companies do, some companies don't, but I think it's crucial that we look at telematics as being a carrot approach as opposed to a stick approach. It shouldn't be punitive at all, and we should get some form of motivational scheme out to the drivers, whether that be a certificate or whether that be some other kind of motivation or reward. Implementation of driver scoring. Drivers need to know where they are today, and they need to know what they need to do to improve. So to have that scoring and for a driver to be able to see their improvement over a period of time is great motivation in itself for them to be able to continue to achieve what we need. There's a lot of good apps around. Some telematics companies have some really great apps which allow the drivers to interact via their mobile phones, to be able to see their performance in real time, and to be able to see where they're ranking against maybe their peers as well. That's a great tool to be able to help get driver buy-in. Healthy competition is always good. One of the most important things is to offer regular feedback. How they're going, how we're going as an organisation, and how we're going as a fleet. And also provide some form of remedial training or some form of coaching to those drivers that may need some improvement. Next one, please, Stephen.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, that's it. Thanks, Stephen. I'll hand it back to you, and we'll go from there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Wayne. Thank you for the comprehensive insight in setting up a telematics policy and the elements that should be in to make sure that there is also driver buy-in and a stakeholder buy-in. Of course, it's always good to also listen to a case study of a fleet manager that has implemented telematics. Before that we go to this case study speaker, just to remind you that at the end of the webinar, there is a Q&A with the experts. And so if you have a question, please, you can use the chat function of the webinar tool. And afterwards, we will then ask the questions of the participants to our experts. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's go now to our case study. The case study is Wincanton, one of the biggest fleets in the UK. And so we really have the honor that their group fleet director, Carl Hanson, is with us today. And Carl, he is going to share with us how he and his company, how they have set up a telematics program that is both beneficial for the drivers, but also for the company itself. Carl, can you hear me?
I can, Stephen. Yep. Hello.
Thank you. So, Carl, we are all eager to learn more about your best practice. So if you are ready, we are ready.
Okay, fantastic. Hi all. Great pleasure to be speaking to you today. As Stephen's already detailed, I'm Carl Hanson, Group Fleet Director for Wincanton, and I'd like to share with you some of my experiences of how we've successfully implemented telematics, and also some of the benefits that we've seen. Wincanton is the UK's largest logistics company, and we operate over 7,500 assets and have circa 4,500 drivers that we use on a daily basis. From my experience, I've experienced a number of different sectors and implemented a number of telematics and behavioural change programs across the different businesses that I've worked for. Next slide, please, Stephen. So telematics isn't new, but I've come across a number of different businesses that fit telematics to vehicles and they aren't happy with the results. And when I joined Wincanton a couple of years ago, this was a similar story. We were operating a number of different solutions across a number of different contracts, and we were seeing mixed and varied results. So I'd like to kind of share with you today what I believe some of the problems to be, what we have done to address some of these issues, and highlight for you what tools really helped us during this process. So what are some of the problems? Generally, I see three problem areas. The first one is with the drivers, and in particular their mindsets. Wincanton operate predominantly heavy goods vehicles, and therefore we use professionally qualified drivers. These drivers have been driving for years and they pride themselves on their driving skills. Most of them have never been involved in an accident, and therefore in their eyes they don't see a problem. In addition, the drivers don't want to be watched, and they see telematics as just another management controlling tool. The second key problem I see is data and measurement. Culturally, companies focus on the areas of return of investment, for example, MPG, and companies try and manage this output and end up missing the key area, which is managing the driver inputs. Another issue across many of the telematics solutions is that there's just too much data. This makes it hard to focus on single issues, and the data sometimes contradicts itself. This makes it especially difficult and hard to explain to the drivers and detracts away from the actions that need to be implemented for the drivers to improve. The third problem I see is time. Management are too busy with a day job and normal day-to-day challenges. A new change in a telematics program is seen as another initiative to implement, and supervisors therefore struggle to give 100% attention. Next slide, please, Stephen. Before I go into what we've done, I just want to share with you what I believe to be a traditional change program. This was a program that we implemented in Wincanton last year, and we were using an existing telematics provider. The results and timeframes we experienced with this program are what I would call traditional, and in that it took us 4 to 5 months to implement the program, and in this period we trained our supervisors and our drivers, and implemented an engagement process. And then over the next 4 or 5 months, we saw those improvements come through. These results, I would say, are typical with a telematics business case, and we saw improvements of around 4% in MPG and a similar improvement in the safety score, so therefore effectively leading to a decrease in damage. This traditional program went well in the fact that we enabled us to engage with the supervisors, we had a process for our driver briefing, and we embedded this process into our daily operations. However, some of the challenges we experienced was a blame culture and blame on circumstances, so our drivers would look to blame other people apart from themselves, whether that be the vehicle, whether it be other drivers, whether it be the conditions. And again, there was too much meaningless data. We found it very hard to concentrate on what the core areas were for us to make a difference and for us to improve. Next slide, please, Stephen. So this initial program was good in the fact that it delivered what we saw from additional business case, but we thought we could achieve more with an integrated camera solution. So what did we do? We went out and we installed a consistent solution in mixed telematics, and this gave us the same platform and consistent data measurement. From an engagement perspective, we trained all our supervisors on both the system and our behavioural safety program, and we introduced a weekly standard reporting mechanism and weekly reviews. This enabled us to both understand the issues in each contract and agree actions for the following week. And the last thing we did was to brief all our drivers on the program and the Mix app. And this gave the ability for the drivers to see their own scores, and we empowered the drivers so they could see how they could improve their own driving style. Next slide, please, Stephen. But the most important thing that we have done is to focus and make all our conversations about safety. In order for people to change their behaviours, they need to understand the emotional and logical reasons for doing so. Wincanton's #1 priority is safety, and therefore implementing this telematic solution is now not seen as another initiative, but as a way to improve safety. Safety gives us both the logical and emotional reasons. No one wants to lose their lives, and we all want everyone to go home safe. So during this process, we focused on safe drivers and not good drivers. We've made the drivers aware of the risks and the likelihood, and many of the drivers believe it will never happen to them. So we've used some of the video footage to show them the potential risks, and this has been especially powerful when the video footage is from either their vehicle or from their colleague's vehicle. We've looked to focus on the consequences, and we've asked questions of our drivers until they absolutely understand what could have happened and where they could have been and what positions they could have done. From a training perspective, historically our driver trainers used to sit with our drivers, but the drivers always behave differently when they're being watched. We now adopt a process whereby driver trainers will sit behind a computer using Mix to build up a specific training plan, and again using some of the video footage we'll put a specific plan together for each driver, so when they go out with the driver and they train them on what they can do, they know their habits and they know how they need to be improved. We like to share with them what safe looks like, and again we'll put a program together with our drivers so they understand what best practice looks like. And one of the key areas of us to improve the success was to effectively monitor the supervisors. By monitoring the supervisors, we were able to understand whether the supervisors truly understand how to use the system and effectively whether they've engaged properly with the drivers. We've recognised during the process that it's extremely difficult for some of our supervisors to tell somebody that they're not very good and they need to improve. And therefore, by monitoring the supervisors and linking the driver's performance to a supervisor, we've been able to understand quickly whether those engagements have taken place and whether they need any more training and help in having those very important conversations with our drivers. Next slide, please, Stephen. So what tools have we used and what's been really useful? On the top left there, we've taken the opportunity to say thank you, and we've recognised the drivers by using certificates. What we've done in each contract is each week the best and most improved driver will receive a certificate, and as I said, it's an opportunity to recognise the drivers and to say thank you. The Mix app allows you to see how many times a driver has logged onto the system, and we've seen a direct correlation with the driver app and driver improvement. So if the driver is using the app, then we've seen the driver improve. This also has allowed us to understand which drivers aren't logging onto the app and which drivers we need to prioritize as to which ones we need to engage with in order to get that improvement and to make sure it happens. Both the app and the videos help our busy transport managers in that it allows the interactions with the drivers to be really quick and precise. And what we've tried to encourage the supervisors to do is, if they are really busy in the transport office, is just to ask some simple questions like, what is your MyMix score? And by asking those questions, the drivers know they're being watched, and it encourages them to use the app. In addition, if there is video footage that we want to share with them, it's really, really easy, and it's less confrontational if the supervisors just play the videos and ask two simple questions. What's gone wrong here? And then how do you look to improve, and how do this make sure this doesn't happen again? And it makes the interaction really quickly. It doesn't mean the supervisors need to build a big program or briefing document with the driver. It's just very quickly watching a 10-second video and just asking some poignant questions. The other thing we started to do as part of the training portal is to introduce videos from the web. And we've done this so we can start to share with drivers what could happen if it does go wrong. So again, they can try and understand some of the consequences of getting it wrong. And this really helps us to emphasize the safety program and effectively why we're doing this and how we want them to go home safe. Next slide, please, Stephen. So what have we achieved? This is an example from one of our contracts, and what the table or graph shows you is that we've improved. We've had a 21% improvement in MPG, and we've had an 84% improvement in our safety RAG score. But probably the biggest thing that I've been most impressed with our program is not necessarily the achievements, but also the speed in which we've achieved this. As I've detailed on the previous slide, I would say a typical implementation program on a behavioural change program would take roughly 4 to 5 months. We've managed to see improvements in literally weeks instead of months. Okay, next slide, please, Stephen. So in summary, safety is key. It's important that you make sure that all your discussions are all about safety and people understand the emotional and logical reasons for change. For long-term results, drivers need to want to change their behaviours and understand the reasons for doing so. I would encourage everybody to use the technology that's available and make it easy for the supervisors and empower the drivers to make their own difference. Regular communication is key to delivering fast results and ensure it's part of a policy or programme. Make it standard business and usual process. And the last point, and probably the most important point, is take the opportunity to say thank you to your drivers and recognise what they deliver for you and build a relationship with them. And that concludes my presentation, Stephen. I'll hand back over to yourself.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carl Hanson of Wincanton. Thank you for the insights and also showing that your telematics program works. This is always good. We are now moving to our Q&A together with our two experts. So we have Mr. Wayne Fee in the room of Mix Telematics and Carl Hanson of Wincanton. So if you have a question, please use the chat function. We are going to start now. Okay. A first question, a question for Wayne. Wayne Fee of Mix Telematics. Wayne, there is a question related, let's say, to the success of telematics according to the business that you have and the employees that you have in the organization. We know, and also Carl showed that, that, for example, for utility vehicles, commercial vehicles, telematics can be, let's say, between brackets, easier to implement than for a benefit fleet. Based on the experiences of mixed telematics, do you think that it's also a necessity and an easy task to do a telematics program within a benefit fleet?
Thanks, Stephen. That's a good question. We have, a variety of fleets around the world. In fact, I think we have around 800,000 connected vehicles, so in all different geographies around the world. And the composition of those fleets is different as well. So we have quite a number of benefit fleets, and we find that the key factors and those points that Carl touched upon in his presentation, I think are key, and we are seeing the same results or similar results in those benefit fleets. So I think that the key points again is that driver buy-in, the regular communication and feedback, and the drivers understanding that they're part of something and a willingness for them to buy into it. And I think also the organisation, we spoke about organisational buy-in from the top down, incredibly important as well if you want to see those kind of results. But in short, to answer your question, yes, we think it's also possible, and we see similar results achieved in those benefit fleets.
Okay, question for Carl. Carl, a little bit going further on the question that I just asked Wayne. You did the telematics program for all drivers within your company. What is your answer, let's say, to fleet managers that say, well, perhaps we don't have the time or the budget to include immediately all drivers? Is there some kind of tips that you can give in terms of the selection of drivers that you should include in your telematics program from the start? Are there any, let's say, clusters that you can make?
No, I would recommend that all drivers are included as part of a program. In order for it to be successful, it does need to be a business-wide program with strategic and recognized business goals, and therefore including everybody, I think, is massively important. And all drivers can improve, and the business can get benefits, whether it be MPG, whether it be socially and culturally from a safety perspective. So for me, it's got to be inclusive and include everybody. So I would guard against trying to restrict it to what you perceive to be maybe the worst drivers, or where you're looking for maybe effectively improvements.
Okay. Another question for you, Carl, is, of course, you start with, let's say, a sort of assessment. You do some you do some driver training. You have also a training portal. Everything that is related to that is, of course, probably done within, let's say, the business hours. How do you calculate, let's say, the return on investment, and what is, let's say, the return on investment of a telematics program in your eyes?
So there's a number of different ways you can look to calculate the return on investment. The obvious one is MPG, especially if you're doing, like our logistics company, a number of high miles. Other ones are reduction in damage. If you've got safer drivers, then the idea being is they shouldn't be involved in so many accidents, and therefore your damage bill will be a lot less. Other ones what you tend to see is reduction in maintenance, because the vehicles aren't driven so harshly, and therefore they will last longer, and they're effectively doing what they're designed to do and not mistreated. Other elements will be fuel theft, and again, telematics can share with you where you've got fuel theft and identify fraudulent activity. But there's an awful lot of different elements that you can use the data within the system to provide business benefit.
Okay. Elaborating on this, going on to Wayne. Wayne, based on, let's say, your services, your experiences, is there with each of your clients a sort of, let's say, a guarantee on the return on investment that they can have?
Yeah, that's another good question, Stephen, to be honest with you. I mean, if I look at all our global implementations and I look at I suppose a typical range, we would see, if we're talking fuel alone as an example, we'd probably see between 8 and 13% would be on the average. Obviously, Carl spoke about, I think, 21 or 22 where those guys are at the moment, which is really good. And we do see some as low as 4 or 5. It depends on a lot of factors. It depends on the vehicle, on the fleet composition. It depends on, in some cases, the geographies and the education of the drivers and the conditions. So it's quite difficult to give a guarantee. And I think, importantly, as we've spoken about throughout the webinar, providing the company buys into the program and providing the drivers buy into the program, then we're going to see those returns consistently. I think, importantly as well, it's important that Carl spoke about the speed in which they achieve some of these results, and I'm sure if you ask Carl, he'll tell us that they've been able to maintain those results, so they're sustainable as well. And I think by adopting that safe culture that the Wincanton have adopted, and by constantly challenging the parameters, if all our drivers have improved so much, can we make an improvement in terms of the configurations of vehicles and tighten them up a little bit and keep challenging the drivers to perform better? It does require. It requires a maintenance. It's telematics isn't a silver bullet, so it requires the programs to be put in place, regular communication, feedback, and everyone's continued buy-in to it, and it creates a culture within an organisation. And we've seen those clients 10, 15 years and still achieving the same results today. So whilst we can't guarantee it, certainly 9 times out of 10, if we have those elements and the support from the company, then we're going to see those results.
Okay. Going back to Carl, it's related to a question that I already asked earlier, but then to Wayne. But here is the question. Carl, you mentioned that your telematics program includes all drivers. Does this mean really all drivers? Also, let's say, the company car drivers, the management cars, and so on? Or is it only related, let's say, to your commercial vehicles, your truck vehicles?
Now, at the moment, we are only focusing on our commercial vehicles. It doesn't then extend to company car drivers at the moment. But you have plans to see if you can extend? Is that what you? I think we'll review once we've done all the once we've completed all the HGV drivers. So we are, for this year, we're about 75% of the way through our fleet in our rollout program.
Okay. A question for Wayne. You talked, and also Carl talked, about the MyMix app. Is there a possibility to link that to the existing telematics solutions of people here in the webinar room? How easy is it, let's say, to link your services to some of the things perhaps that people already have in place when it comes to driver behavior and telematics?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Yes and no. It would obviously depend on what programs and what systems the participants already have in place. I would say, though, for those who are looking to implement today, then gamification is a great tool. It's today's world, right? Where it's the way that the generation is brought up, and I think that gamification is a really great tool. And Carl spoke about the success, and we see huge success from drivers being able to, the drivers being able to actually log into an application, see how they're performing in real time, and also it creates the competition. They can see how they're performing against their peers. And the regular users will be successful. So, certainly I think a lot of telematics providers today would offer some gamification or some application tools to use. But I would say, again, for those who are thinking about implementing them, then to make sure that the provider you're thinking about going with has some sort of gamification or some sort of application.
Okay. Carl, you mentioned in the beginning of your case study that one of the problems that you saw was that perhaps there is too much focus on the outputs instead of managing the inputs. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? What do you mean by it? And what is your, let's say, advice for people in the room to make sure that they understand that topic correctly?
I suppose I'll probably the best way to explain it is probably what Wayne's described in answering one of his questions. A lot of companies see telematics as a silver bullet, and they think that because they've installed a box into a vehicle, that they're going to get the instant results that they expect that they've seen and detailed in the business case. And the point I'm making about managing the inputs is about using the data. So the only way you will achieve the business case benefits and achieve the benefits of the system is if you use the data that the system is telling you is there. And the point is that obviously telematics will provide all of the outputs and tell you how you will perform. But the problem is that people look to try and effectively look for a silver bullet response to managing those outputs, when realistically what they need to be doing is managing each one of the inputs, which is invariably the drivers.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Going a little bit further on that, Carl, you mentioned that you started, let's say, with traditional telematics system that was already in place or that you knew, but then that you then moved, let's say, to the mixed telematics solution. And one of the reasons that you changed and one of the, let's say, issues that you saw was the amount of data that was generated. Now, the question is related to the fact, if you change from one telematics provider or one telematics solution to the other, isn't it so that the amount of data stays the same?
It's very true. So yes, mixed telematics can provide all the data that the other companies can provide. What we wanted to do, though, is focus on a specific area, and you can still do that with other telematics providers. We just saw big benefits in enabling us just to concentrate on simple measures, which is what Nick's pointed us to.
Okay, a question for Wayne. One of the biggest hurdles for fleets and for companies probably to start with telematics is that issue that Carl also underlined, and I even think that you mentioned it in your presentation, Wayne, the aspect of spying, the aspect of Big Brother is watching you. What is your answer to those companies that say, well, within our company it will not be possible because they will always refer to Big Brother?
Yeah, and it's a topical conversation with legislation like GDPR and certain privacy regulations in lots of countries around the world. So we come across that objection quite frequently, and I think the answer to that is again engagement, where we have work councils and we involve them from day one, and we involve the drivers, and as I said throughout the presentation, explaining that the objective at the end of the day is for the drivers to go home safe for themselves and for their families and for the organisation. It's got to be a benefit from the drivers. In some cases, where legislation is in place, we're able to anonymise data. We're able to not track drivers during private times, etc., etc. So all these objections certainly have a way that we can work around that. And again, it's just transparency, communication, and making sure the drivers understand what we are and what we aren't going to do, and making sure at the end of the day that they're comfortable with it. And I think in 99% of the cases, we're able to overcome those objections.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Carl, a question for you. You make quite some wins and successes via your telematics policy. Is it also so that some of the, let's say, gains, some of the benefits, some of the cost wins that you have, then those are shared with the drivers, the employees, or is it so that everything goes to the company?
No, everything benefits-wise goes back to the company. I've had experience in the past of trying to incentivize drivers by offering them some bonus around fuel or some or things of that nature. However, in my experience, it doesn't work long term.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as individuals, we're all driven by and incentivized by different things, whether it be money, time, safety, security, or recognition. And the challenge is if you make it allocated to their specific individual improvements down to money, then you spend an awful lot more time concentrating on individual data events than you do on effectively trends. And interestingly, we're not after all our drivers to be the best driver or the safest driver. What we want is all our drivers to be green drivers, to be safe drivers. So if they have an event in a week, then so what? We're not really that bothered. What we don't want is 100 events in a week. People switch on and switch off, and actually things will happen to them on the road which they can't control because maybe another driver's pulled out in front of them or something's happened to them. So it gets too emotionally attached sometimes if you link it to money. We find it far more powerful by just saying thank you and well done.
Okay, thank you. A question for Wayne. Wayne, there is a customer in the webinar room who has a specific issue. For example, he has a specific issue in Germany where, there is a very strong workers' council and they will not allow them to measure individual driver performance. Do you have any ideas, any experience how to get around this issue?
Yeah, again, Carl, it depends on the work council, and as I said, we make it a point of as soon as we're talking to a company who wants to implement and engaging with a work council as well. We haven't yet had a work council who's done what the participant is talking about in forbidding that, but certainly we could, we could speak with them, and I think that's transparency is the key again. We haven't seen it. We've had some quite difficult conversations, but we've always been able to come to an agreement and allow implementation. So, that's all I can say. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of the particular incident, but communication would be the answer.
Okay. Another question for you, Wayne. Can you briefly explain how global mixed telematics is? Are you in every continent?
So we're in 120 countries around the world, Stephen. So we're truly global. We have 130 partners, 120 countries in every continent around the world.
Okay. A final question for Carl. Carl, what is the secret in your eyes about achieving success with telematics and also keeping that success over a longer period of time?
I think the key to the success is, as I said earlier, using the data and looking to change the driver's habits, in that the drivers want to change and they believe that it is in their own interest to change those habits. And once you've changed those habits, you've effectively you get to a point where you've got a sustainable solution. So it's easy for us to track and monitor whether a driver starts to develop some bad habits again, but again they start to stand out and you start to trend them, and it's very easy to just to get them back on focus. But yeah, the key success is making the drivers want to and believe that they need to change their driving style.
Okay. Gentlemen, thank you very much. For the audience, we have to end this webinar, this Global Fleet webinar, with the support of Mixed Telematics here right now. Thank you very much to everyone for being with us. For sure, a big thank you to Carl Hanson of Wincanton and Wayne Fee of Mixed Telematics. As you can see, there will also be a recorded version of this webinar that we will put online within a few days so that you can relive this webinar. And we will also ask you to answer a short satisfaction survey so that we know how you did appreciate this webinar and so that we can improve our future webinars. And so for the rest, I hope that you enjoyed this webinar on setting up a telematics policy. Thank you very much and have a nice day. Bye-bye.